What's going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 5 of the Fair Catch Podcast. I'm Gabe Calderon, and on tonight's episode, I'm slowly going to begin to transition the podcast into the form of a fantasy football-oriented show over the next month or so, as the end of the fantasy football regular season for most of us is drawing close, and winning your games is becoming more and more critical in deciding whether or not you're going to make or miss your league's playoffs. But, I'll talk more about that in depth on next week's episode when I begin the 4-episode span of shows relating to fantasy football, start-sit-em advice, roster management, outlook, and projections for each week to come, etc., all the good stuff pertaining to fantasy football. So tune in next week for the start of that. And as far as tonight's episode is concerned, I'm just going to cover a Week 10 recap, talk about 3 standout games in detail, then jump into a discussion about the current state of the AFC North and how those 4 teams are faring thus far and what's ahead for them. Then I'm going to wrap things up with a kind of a teaser segue segment on fantasy football to get you all ready and pumped up for the in-depth fantasy football episodes to come over the next 4 weeks. And on this episode, it's just going to be a start-sit-em advice for every running back in each game next week, who to start, who to sit. So let's jump into it. Sunday recap. Thursday night blowout for the Steelers at home. Bears secure first place in the NFC North against division rival Detroit. And an absolute massacre in the jungle, visiting Saints scoring 38 unanswered points over the span of 2 quarters in that one. And Nick Chubb's 209 scrimmage yards proves to be enough to get the win at home for the Browns over the Falcons. And last-second fumble just absolutely puts the nail in the coffin for Doug Marrone and the Jaguars. Cardinals put up a surprising fight in Arrowhead but fell short to the Chiefs. And the Bills stunned the Jets in a blowout win at MetLife. And the Buccaneers racking up 500-plus yards of total offense and scored 3 points. Falling to the visiting Redskins 16-3. Upset of the day, in my opinion, Titans in manhandling fashion, defeating the visiting Patriots, holding them to only 10 points and keeping Brady out of the end zone. The Chargers keep streaking in another impressive road win over the Raiders, and Aaron Jones, not Rodgers, for the Packers had a career day in the win for the Pack over the visiting Dolphins. And the Rams improved to 9-1 in another thriller against the Seahawks at home. And a stunned crowd in Philly. Zeke Elliott and the boys ran all over the Eagles in a big statement win. And vintage Eli Manning and the boys in blue. Game-winning drive late in the 4th quarter out in San Francisco. Monday night primetime football, nothing like it. Love to see the Giants coming away with a win in that one. So let's jump into the 3 games that I want to talk about in detail. And I want to start with the Saints traveling up north, southwest Ohio, to take on the Cincinnati Bengals. So I talked about it last week on the show, right? If Cincinnati couldn't get something going in this game early and ride out that momentum, this game would be over at halftime. And I said it last week on the show, and this was a massacre. I don't think I've seen a team play as bad as the Bengals did after the first quarter all year. I talked about in great detail Joe Mixon and the Bengals' job offensively to get him going early and sticking with him. They did just that, but only in the first quarter. This was a 7-7 game at the end of the first quarter. Mixon had 6 carries for 35 yards on the ground, looked to make a dent in that stingy Saints run defense that's topping the league right now in run defense. And the Saints started the game with a 15-play touchdown drive, taking up more than half of the first quarter. But the Bengals answered right back on a nice opening drive of their own, even the score out at 7 apiece. And I'm thinking to myself watching this game, I'm like, all right, Bengals came out to play. Hopefully this will be a shootout. 35-30 kind of game, something like that. But that's just when things went all downhill. As soon as I started to get wishful thinking, this is when the Bengals just let it go. I need to highlight Marvin Lewis's strange obsession with Giovanni Bernard. And not to knock Gio or anything, but he really had no business being on the field for as much as he was on Sunday. Joe Mixon had a negative rush early in the second quarter. And after that, Bernard came in for the rest of the half and made absolutely no impact. I'm sitting there, I'm scratching my head. I really don't get it. I'm trying to understand this logic behind the madness that's going on in Cincinnati. Not only their atrocious defense, but their offense can't seem to get something clicking and going and just being consistent. The Bengals, like I said, this was a 7-7 game at the end of the first quarter. The Bengals had 3 drives in the second quarter, and it was punt, interception in that order. There was only 11 plays ran in that quarter for the Bengals. And for those of you watching that game or saw the highlights, Andy Dalton threw a late interception at the end of the first half. Saints bring it down into the red zone, and the Saints run one play and score a touchdown as time expired in the first half. This went from a 7-7 game at the start of the second quarter to a 35-7 game at halftime. Bengals got outscored 28-0 in the second quarter at home. It's just absolutely embarrassing. And I don't know why the Bengals fired their defensive coordinator, Terrell Austin, on Monday. Should have been fired at halftime along with Marvin Lewis. Andy Dalton threw 12 of 20 passing with 2 picks and a touchdown. And this is another concern. Considering how awful the Saints secondary has been this year. It's a balanced defense because of how good their run defense is, but their secondary is atrocious. The Bengals yet again found themselves in a position to have to abandon the run game. And honestly, I don't know how much of an impact A.J. Green would have had made if he was in this game. And it looks like Green is set to miss another week, next week against Baltimore in another key divisional game for the Bengals. Not only is this Bengals team just flat out garbage on defense, their offense is just far too inconsistent for me to take this team seriously. Andy Dalton, I'm going to say it, is overrated. Overrated. This was the game for him to prove himself, prove his worth on a big game Sunday. We all know his terrible record in primetime games. This wasn't a primetime game, but this was as high stakes of a game as you're going to get. A.J. Green out, going up against a weak secondary, knows he's going to have to show up and put up points to compete, and he just laid a big old fat goose egg. Not much to say about the Saints in this game. Everyone showed up. Big day on the ground for Mark Ingram. 13 for about 100-something on the ground. Caught a few passes for a touchdown. Alvin Kamara finding himself in the end zone multiple times. Nothing new there. And Michael Thomas, big play after big play all afternoon. Drew Brees passing Brett Favre's touchdown record. The list goes on. And after seeing what happened at Carolina on Thursday against Pittsburgh, I think the NFC South is the Saints for the taking. This is their division to lose. Now I want to talk about the Jaguars at Indianapolis. Okay, big key divisional game. All right, this is my favorite game of Week 10 personally. Like I said, key divisional game for the two teams at the bottom of the division looking up right now. Both coming off their bye weeks. Leonard Fournette, the bulldozing freight train in the backfield for the Jaguars, making his return after missing most of the season. Hasn't played more than a half all year. And the Colts, the Indianapolis Colts, after, getting off to a sluggish, embarrassing start to the season, coming off back-to-back blowout wins. Jaguars looking to turn a corner and get back on track after the bye week. Indianapolis Colts turned around their season a few weeks before the bye week, looked to keep it going. This was an exciting game in my eyes. This game had a lot of hype around it for me. The Colts were 3-point favorites at home. And despite the Jags getting blown out in game after game in the previous weeks, I just had a feeling. I had this weird feeling, that they were going to keep this game close. Leonard Fournette was going to make an impact, and that's why I decided to tune in. A lot of question marks surrounding the expected workload for Leonard Fournette going into Sunday's game out of the backfield. I was following the buildup of his return all week, obviously for fantasy purposes, and he's also one of my favorite players to watch when he's healthy. Loved him at LSU. Loved him his first year in the league. And the experts seem to be split 50-50 on his opinion. Half of them saying, the Jags got Carlos Hyde and TJ Yeldon. They're going to ease Fournette in, maybe give him 10 to 12 carries. Other experts saying, hey, he's been practicing in full pads all week, and this is the biggest game of the year for the Jags so far. He's going to get 20 to 25 touches. And, we all know the type of running back Leonard Fournette is. If he's getting the start for the Jaguars, he's getting 25 carries minimum. I don't care how the game is going. He could be like, if Freddie Kitchens was coaching this team, they could be down 40. You'd say, we're running the ball. They're going to give him the ball. Doug Marrone understands this. The Jaguars understand this. Leonard Fournette does. This is the kind of back that they drafted out of LSU. They knew what they needed. They wanted someone that they could give 20 to 25 carries to wear the defense down late in the fourth quarter, and Leonard Fournette's just smiling there saying, I'm just getting started. So I was a little unsure about what to expect, honestly, from his return, just because, a lingering hamstring injury for as long as he's been kept out. I don't know if he might suffer a setback or if there was something that the Jaguars weren't telling the media. So I wasn't doubting his ability in the slightest, but, it was hard to predict, how the coaching staff would approach the situation. But, long story short, Fournette carried the ball 24 times. Granted, it was only for 53 yards, but he got a few goal line touches. He scored on the ground, also caught 5 passes for 55 yards and scored through the air as well. He had a breakout game in his return. I loved it. The early stage of this game was the Eric Ebron show for the Colts. He had 3 touchdowns midway through the second quarter. He caught 2, ran 1. The Colts scored a touchdown on every drive except 1 in the first half. And, the Jaguars probably did the best that they could have done to score and keep this game close, considering what they've shown us on offense so far this year. They scored 16 points in the first half. And, they made this a 29-16 game going into the locker room. And, when the Colts kept scoring and the Jags couldn't stop them, I wasn't getting that same feeling, that same sense as I was getting in previous weeks watching the Jags, losing to Houston, losing to Kansas City, Dallas, you know what I mean? I wasn't getting that sense in previous weeks that the Jags were just going to give up. And I don't know how, but, this feeling that they weren't going to, give up. They were going to come out fighting. They were going to find a way to close the gap in the second half. The defense was going to buckle down. And the Jags shut the Colts out in the second half. 2 punts, an interception, and a missed field goal for the Colts. Jags defense looked like the Jags defense we remember from last year. Jags offense tried their absolute best to tie this game late in the fourth quarter, but they just came up short and fell to the Colts 29-26. Unfortunate catch and fumble late in the game for the Jaguars. They were out of timeouts. They were in scoring position, turned the ball over, couldn't get the ball back, and they fell to the Colts by 3 points. And, honestly, I think the injury to Leonard Fournette has had the biggest impact. It's been the difference between the Jags being a 500 team or an over 500 team and being dead last in this division. His toughness running the ball, even if it was only for about 2 yards a carry, but on every run, it just seemed to spark the Jaguars. Seeing that physicality, that hard-nosed running. I haven't seen the Jags play defense the way they did in the second half on a Sunday all year. And I truly believe having Fournette back made a difference for them. Not only their offense, but for their defense. It kind of gave them that extra boost. You know what I mean? Just seeing them back there, fighting through injury, coming back despite the Jags being 3 games under 500, is fighting, trying to get the win for the team. And I just think this has been an unfortunate year for the Jaguars as a whole. They have a whole list of problems on both offense and defense that I could, talk about for a whole episode. And their chances of making the playoffs is slim to none. But I hope to see them, play the year out and go into next season with a little chip on their shoulder, with a little something to prove. This was a team last year that was 1 win away from playing the Eagles in the Super Bowl. I'm a big fan of the Jaguars. I love the way they play, when they play well. But I think we'll have to wait until next year to really see them compete at the level they did last year. Now I'll talk about the Redskins and Buccaneers. Now, I want to talk about this game mainly because the Redskins, by some godsend of a miracle, are first place in the AFC East. And the way things have been shaping up so far this year, it really doesn't seem like a bad guess to say the Redskins, they might probably and will win the NFC East and make the playoffs with a 500 record. 4 divisional games left for the Redskins, 2 against the Eagles, and 1 apiece against the Giants and Cowboys. And then they have to travel to both Jacksonville and Tennessee in weeks 15 and 16. So a very, very tough schedule moving forward for Washington. And to be honest, I don't think I'm the only one who thinks this, I think the Redskins are not a good football team. I was going to say I think the Redskins are a bad football team. I don't think they're a bad football team, but I don't think they're a great football team. I think they're still ranked dead last in passing yards per game, around 212, 215, something like that. Maurice Harris, Josh Doxson, not really the receivers that are going to get the job done and make moves in the playoffs. Only 2 of their 6 wins so far this year have been against teams with a 500 record or better. And that's being Carolina and Green Bay. And you could technically only saying 1 of their 6 wins going into Sunday because Green Bay, before their win on Sunday against Miami, had a sub 500 record. And they've suffered 2 blowout losses this year, 1 at home. And, when I look at the Redskins' wins, it's just really not all that impressive as a whole. And there's no signs of consistency whatsoever with this football team. Their offense is bad, and their defense at times have been exposed in the 2 blowout losses they've suffered. And Sunday's game was a perfect example of a football game that they had no business being in, let alone winning. And if they had played a halfway decent team that was able to execute and not make mistake after mistake, they would have lost the game. Tampa Bay had 501 yards of total offense to Washington's 286, almost doubled them up there in that category. And the Bucs doubled them up with twice as many passing yards, 398 to 170. The Bucs had missed 2 field goals. They threw 2 interceptions and lost 2 fumbles. And keep in mind, they coughed it up on the ground 4 times, fortunate to only have lost 2 of them. Mike Evans dropping wide open touchdown catches. Probably the worst game I've seen all year from any team with that many total yards of offense and just fail to execute at every phase of the game. The Redskins weren't much better, to be honest. Only 1 touchdown on the day, only 1 touchdown in the game. This was a game that was projected to be a back and forth, relatively high scoring, close game. I don't really know what to make of this game. And I was watching this. I had no idea what was going on. The first half from both of these teams had solid drives. They had solid drives that set themselves up for scoring opportunities, but just couldn't punch in 6. It was a confusing game to watch and try to understand, but it's just really boiled down to failure to execute by both teams. More so the Buccaneers, obviously. Buccaneers, one of the worst defenses as a whole in the entire league coming into Sunday. And this was a Redskins team that was 2 games over 500 and coming off a blowout loss at home to Atlanta. I expected the Skins to rebound and take advantage of this matchup and look to use Alex Smith and AP's experience to lead the team to a tough-fought road win. But that's what happened. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that's not what happened. But I think it was more so the Bucs' failure to execute that gave Washington the win, which raised a lot of red flags and concerns for me. If the Redskins put up only 16 points, 4 field goals and a touchdown to any other team that racked up, 3 field goals and a touchdown to any other team that racked up 500 yards of offense, I guarantee they get blown out. Redskins just don't have that stud that a lot of other playoff-bound teams have right now. Their leading receiver right now is tight end Jordan Reed, who we all know is far from consistent. He has 391 receiving yards. And granted, Adrian Peterson has been having himself a decent 2018 campaign. The ground game just doesn't look as good as it should be, considering how bad the passing game is and considering the record of the Redskins. It just doesn't add up. It's a bunch of question marks and red flags as to how these Redskins are getting these wins. So I'm interested to see moving forward how the NFC East plays out with the Redskins, leading the charge right now. I don't think the Redskins really at all are as good as their record shows. And I think a lot of people know that. Like I was saying, I think the NFC East is still up for grabs. No one's safe right now. They got the Eagles and Cowboys both sitting about 2-3 games behind. Hey, I don't want to back up Odell Beckham's wild statement saying they're going to run the table, go 9-7 and make the playoffs, but anything's possible. But like I mentioned before, 4 divisional games remaining for the Skins, 2 back-to-back tough road games against stout defenses. This could be the Redskins' divisional lose, much like the Saints. So let's see how that plays out moving forward. Now I want to jump into my next segment and talk about the AFC North. The AFC North has always been my favorite division growing up. Just a hard, physical division, great divisional games every time these teams play one another. And this has been quite an interesting year for all four of these teams. It's chaos right now in that division. Steelers lead the division with 6-2-1 record and continue streaking. They've won 5 straight games. Bengals, after being slaughtered by the Saints at home, somehow still sit at number 2 in the division with a 5-4 record. And the Ravens at 4-5, losers of 3 straight games, are just a game ahead of the Browns, who are at the bottom of the division at 3-6-1. So, it's a very tight division. One game separates each team in ascending order. You got the Browns 3-6, the Ravens with 4 wins, the Bengals with 5, and the Steelers with 6. So, this has been an interesting division. So I want to go with Baltimore Ravens. They had their bye week this Sunday, right? Joe Flacco, a lot of talk about him and his status going into this week. He's likely going to be out. I think it's been confirmed that Lamar Jackson is going to get the start for John Harbaugh against Cincinnati. And through the first 4 weeks of the season, the Ravens really looked like a strong team, bound for an 11-5 type of season, winning the AFC North, giving the Steelers a fight for their money. They started off the year 3-1. Unfortunate loss to the Bengals early in the year when the Bengals actually looked like a good football team. Then they had an up-and-down 3-game stretch, losing to the Browns in overtime in a field goal fest, 12-9, shutting out the Titans on the road, 21-0, and then losing by only 1 point to the Saints, who right now are considered the best team in football. So, that game that the Saints played against the Ravens, that Saints-Ravens game a couple of weeks ago, I thought that was one of the most exciting back-and-forth games I've seen all year. But, that game, that loss to the Saints set them in a downward spiral, and they've lost, the next 2 after that. The losers of 3 straight going into the bye week this past Sunday. And, Joe Flacco has been having a subpar year for the standard that a lot of people hold him to, including myself. The ground game has been a severe issue for the Ravens all year, with no clear-cut rusher and no rush over 400 yards yet. A lot of fumbles for Alex Collins as well. Ball security has been an issue. And, while the receiving core has been doing their best, they just don't have the receivers. They don't have the weapons to really go toe-to-toe with a lot of these teams in the AFC. Willie Snead, John Brown, the speedster deep threat on the outside, Michael Crabtree. It's just really not the offensive weapons that are going to win you this division or even make a push for a wild card spot right now. But, the defense is, it's been solid. Still ranking in the top 10 in the 3 major defensive categories, rushing and passing yards given up per game and total yards given up per game. So, hats off to the Ravens defense, but it's been slipping up the past 3 weeks. But is their defense enough to carry the Ravens to a spot in the playoffs? And we all know great defenses, sure, they win games. But with an offense that's filled with so many question marks right now, I think the answer is no. I think it's just no. I think the best that we can expect of the Ravens is a late wild card push. And, they only have 2 divisional games left against Cleveland and Cincy. But they also still have to play Kansas City on the road and the Chargers on the road. So I honestly, if I was a betting man, I don't like the Baltimore Ravens playoff chances moving forward. I think they only win at best 2 to 3 more games the rest of the season. And again, the whole Joe Flacco, Lamar Jackson status, who's starting a quarterback moving forward, is going to play a big factor into that. I think they finish off maybe around 8-8. I'm sorry, not 8-8. I think they might finish off 6-10, 7-9. And miss out on a wild card spot. And I don't think there's any conversation for them winning the division. Now we'll talk about the last place Cleveland Browns. Since Greg Williams has taken over the interim head coaching role for the Cleveland Browns, they've looked like a much better team from what I've watched. Granted, they kind of got blown out 2 weeks ago against Kansas City, but they were putting up a fight in the first half, and they didn't quit. And it was a tough transitional period that first week for the Browns with Hugh Jackson gone, Todd Haley gone, but over 400 yards of offense for the Browns. in each of the last 2 games. And that's what I was talking about. They didn't give up against Kansas City. They were still fighting. And this team's finding ways to score, which is, standing out to me. Notably in that impressive win a few days ago against Atlanta. Baker Mayfield during this stretch with Greg Williams. 5 touchdowns, only 1 pick in that span. And the ground game looks incredible. I think they did Nick Chubb, they did the whole Browns fan base, they did everyone on that team a favor by getting rid of Carlos Hyde, who I don't think is worth a 6th round, 7th round, if they had the 13th round draft pick. Nick Chubb has been carrying the ball well, better than well. He's been great. He's averaging over 20 touches each of the last 2 weeks, and he's coming off a 209 total yards from scrimmage game with a couple of touchdowns. The problem is, though, is it might be too little too late for the Browns right now. This is a team that's currently at the bottom looking up at the rest of the division, couple games out of the second wild card spot. And, the wild card hopes are slim, but there's still that slight possibility. We've all seen crazier things happen. As far as the wild card's concerned, the Chargers are obvious front runners to get the first wild card spot, but from the looks of things, it's still a wide open race. It's a wide open race for that second spot. The Bengals currently in front with only a 5-4 record. You got the Dolphins right behind them. So the Browns are only 2 games back from the second wild card spot, and they have a tie. They do have a tie to their name, which will give them the tiebreaker in a scenario where they're tied with the same amount of wins for that second spot in the wild card with another team, but that tie might play a factor, so who knows? But the Browns have a tough schedule ahead. Having to play 4 of their last 6 games on the road, bye week coming up, chance to recuperate, put some pieces together. But like I said, 4 of their last 6 games are on the road, as well as 3 divisional games. So I'm not counting the Browns out. I'm not counting them out by any means. But from what I've seen the past 2 weeks, this is a team that I think if they win 4 or 5 out of their 9, that's a stretch. To ask them to win 4 or 5 out of their last 6 games, they can make the playoffs. Sure, they'll need a lot of help from other teams, and it's a slim chance. But even if they don't make the playoffs, and I know that's a long shoot, I still expect this young, explosive Browns team to compete for the rest of the season. They're going to compete, they're going to fight, and they're just going to ride out the season. They're not going to give up. They're going to try to play every game and keep the games close and competitive moving forward. Now we talk about the first place Steelers. Division-leading Steelers, they're winning 5 straight games. They won 5 straight, including a blowout win, 52-21 at home this past Thursday against the Panthers. And they look to be the dominant force in this division and quite possibly, in the AFC up there with Kansas City, San Diego. I'm not San Diego. I keep saying San Diego. The LA Chargers. It just sounds weird to say the LA Chargers. I don't know why. I'm going to keep calling them San Diego because I don't care. But anyway, I think that they can compete with the Pats, Chargers, Chiefs. One of the most balanced and dynamic offenses in football right now. And I think that they're just not getting the recognition they deserve. I think they're just being constantly overshadowed by the likes of New Orleans, Kansas City, and the LA Rams for airtime in terms of people talking about, who's the best offense? Who's the best team in the National Football League right now? And, James Conner is the story of the season for the Steelers so far. He has overperformed in the absence of Le'Veon Bell. He's currently second in the entire NFL in yards from scrimmage, and he's getting utilized. Second to only Todd Gurley, so that's saying something. And he's getting utilized well in the screen game, the passing game. He's goal line dependent time and time again, and Mike Tomlin can give him 25 carries if that's what's asked of him. This young back has been superb so far. I don't think they're missing Le'Veon Bell in the slightest. He scored 8 total touchdowns in the last 5 weeks, and he's rushed for over 100 yards in all of those games except one. And then you got their receiving core. Antonio Brown, number 84, leads the NFL in receiving touchdowns with 10 so far this year. And Juju Smith-Schuster is an exceptional complimentary receiver to the 4-time All-Pro wideout. He's an awesome – Big Ben loves throwing to this guy. Smith-Schuster, that is, and Brown. It's a great 1-2 punch, and then you add in James Conner on the ground. It's a scary offense. Big Ben, fourth in the league in passing yards. And, I can go on and on about the Steelers team, but I think you guys get the point. This is a potent and deadly offense that is set to make some serious noise in the playoffs this year. Tough schedule remaining for the Steelers, though, moving forward. They still have to play the Chargers. They still have to play the Patriots. And they still have to play the Saints all in December. And they only have one divisional game left, and that's against the Bengals in Week 17. I think the game against New England in mid-December will determine who gets the 2 seed in the AFC. And I think Kansas City will lock up the 1 seed by Week 14, Week 15. And the AFC South is still a big question mark for me. Houston winning 6 straight, leading the AFC South right now at 6 wins. The Titans with 5 wins, they're in second. Colts, Jaguars, it's still a big question mark. So I'm comfortable in saying that the 2 seed is going to go most likely between the Patriots or the Steelers. So the Bengals, here we are again. The last team to talk about in the AFC North. Second place in the division. The abomination that is the Cincinnati Bengals right now, the team that ranks dead last in every major defensive category. Let's work our way nice and slow down the list. I don't want to, take anything away from the Cincinnati Bengals. 141 yards of turf given up by this defense a game on the ground. 313 passing yards given up every game. And 454 total yards of offense given up a game by this Cincinnati Bengals abomination. Now let's look at what's taken place in Cincinnati after being demolished 51-14 at home. Now, the Bengals fired defensive coordinator Terrell Austin on Monday, who I'm surprised was even allowed to step foot inside the locker room after Sunday's loss. Should have been out of there at halftime. Marvin Lewis comes out later on Monday, starts blabbering, and says, I'm going to take over the defense moving forward. I'm going to handle the play calling. God forbid. And then he makes this ridiculous announcement that he's bringing aboard, guess who, for those of you that haven't heard yet, Hugh Jackson, who has a worse coaching record than Chris Davis's batting average. And he's bringing him on as the special assistant to the head coach. What in the hell? This is a joke. I cannot wait to watch this game next Sunday. Going to order some nice hot wings, going to make popcorn. I can't wait to watch this game between the Bengals and Ravens and see what Marvin Lewis has to say after the game. Matter of fact, I want to see what he has to say at halftime. He didn't say anything at halftime last week, just ran straight to the tunnel. Speechless. I can't wait to see what he has to say after this. They're going to get blown out. Again. I want to see what his reaction and what can he possibly say that's going to make any type of sense to back up the excuse of their defense. Probably going to give up 300 yards and 4 touchdowns to Lamar Jackson. Probably a couple on the ground to Alex Collins. Maybe 100 yards on the ground there. A nice little 450 yards total offense, 500 total offense for the Ravens who've been struggling. I think he's got to have, I'm talking about Marvin Lewis, I think he's got to have some kind of dirty pictures or something on the Bengals GM, Mike Brown, to have kept this job as long as he has. I don't know how I like the Bengals' chances for the rest of the year or moving for any season coming up with Marvin Lewis at the helm. I cannot see a drastic change in defensive discipline, offensive consistency, anything to warrant giving them any serious thought as playoff contenders. I didn't talk about games. 5.5. Let's talk about last week. 5.5 point underdogs at home against the Saints. I would have taken the Saints to cover by 21, at least. 5.5 points. Unbelievable. They'll be lucky to win 2 of their last 7 games and hopefully put the offseason time to good use and figure out why they haven't won a playoff game since before I was born. 2 straight losing seasons. Looks like it's going to be a third one at the end of this year. I mean, this is a joke. This team is so bad. I don't know why Bengal fans are putting up with this. I'm not, I don't read the local Bengal, the Cincinnati paper, or go on the, Bengals football website, or, hear what's really going on. But I'm sure as hell curious. I'm speechless. I do not understand. You could not pay me to try to understand what's going on in Cincinnati. Only time will tell, I guess. Yeah, okay, so that glad I ended that with the Bengals, so I get all that worked up energy out of me and get a little pumped up for the start sit-em segment for Week 11 moving forward. So like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I'm going to try to cool off a little bit as I read through this little intro for this segment. So, moving forward with the podcast in the upcoming weeks, I'm going to try and shift the structure of the show to strictly fantasy football only. As the regular season for fantasy football winds down, it's coming to a close, and playoffs are right around the corner for all our leagues. It's time to buckle down and win every game you can moving forward to make it to your league's playoffs. So each week going forward, the show is going to consist of mostly who to start, who to sit, roster management, with the trade deadline coming up next week, and, fantasy outlook and projections for each week coming up, and so on and so forth. Basically everything that can help you guys win your games, give you guys some insight, some advice for fantasy football. So I have a little teaser in store for this episode. It's just going to be a start sit-em for the running back position in every game next week. So let's just get things started. All right, 6 teams on bye week next week. That's the Bills, Dolphins, Pats, Jets, and Browns, and the 49ers. And, not really a big hit on the fantasy side, as there's, only a handful of players from those teams who have had any consistent fantasy relevance. George Kittle comes to mind. Nick Chubb as of late comes to mind. So a couple of players on the Patriots. So let's start out Thursday night, Green Bay at Seattle. A couple of days away. Let's start out in Green Bay. For the Packers, we really just have Aaron Jones, and he's finally solidified himself as the primary back after his breakout 32-point fantasy game last week against Miami. He carried the ball 15 times for 145 yards and 2 scores. Exceptional. We were all waiting for that Aaron Jones breakout game, and it finally happened. He's leading the NFL among all running backs who qualify in yards per carry. I expect a heavy workload for Jones, not only on Thursday, but moving forward. He's playing against a decent Seattle run defense who's given up a league average 23 fantasy points to opposing running backs they face. So for me, Aaron Jones is a high-end running back too, with a lot of running back one upside this week, against a Seattle team that likes to run the ball a lot, but Chris Carson out, a lot of question marks at the running back position. I think this is going to be a game that Green Bay controls the pace, going to give Aaron Jones, I think, upwards of 15 to 20 carries. Must start for me. Now on the Seattle side, of the ball, there's 3 guys in the mix. Last week we saw Rashad Penny coming off a solid outing, Mike Davis contributing well, and Chris Carson, who was out last week. So Chris Carson didn't play Sunday, and I don't expect him to play on the short week. Even if he does, he's not going to be getting the bulk of the carries out of the backfield. So that leaves us with Rashad Penny and Mike Davis. And despite Penny having probably the more productive game on the ground on Sunday, I still think Mike Davis is the guy in Seattle. I still think he's better than Chris Carson. I think he's better than Rashad Penny. He's used a lot more in the passing game than the other backs, and he runs the ball well when his number's called and he gets touches. I like Davis a lot in this matchup, but only in deeper leagues as a low-end running back 2 option. Now we head out to Indianapolis, visiting Titans, taking on the Colts. So for Tennessee, we have Dion Lewis, Derrick Henry. And despite, Derrick Henry coming off a 2-touchdown game, who had fantasy owners, scratching their heads, people were writing him out all year. Probably last week was the last straw, dropped him. And now he comes out and scores 2 touchdowns, tough luck. But, Dion Lewis, don't worry. Dion Lewis is still the guy that I like and a lot of people like out of this backfield. He has a good matchup this week versus a Colts team that has been struggling against opposing running backs they faced. And Dion Lewis has had 2 back-to-back 20-carry games with a lot of upside as a receiver. I like Dion Lewis a lot moving forward. I like him in this one. High-end running back 2 play with a lot of positive upside this week. Colts, on the other hand, we really just have Marlon Mack. And, disappointing outing last week after having 2 monster back-to-back performances that, he rushed for 125 yards in each of those games and scored at least 1 touchdown in each as well before the bye week. He faces another tough matchup, though, this week against the Titans defense that is second best right now among all defenses against opposing backfields. Giving up on average 17 fantasy points to opposing backfields. So, I'm really concerned about Marlon Mack in this matchup. I was a little concerned about him last week against Jacksonville. I see something very similar in this game coming up. I think there's going to be minimal upside for Marlon Mack in this game, and for that reason, I think you have to sit him this week. Unless you're really stretched at the running back position, you can give him the start maybe at a flex spot, but considering the matchup, I think you got to lean away from Marlon Mack in this one. Now we go out to MetLife Stadium. Tampa Bay Buccaneers taking on the New York Giants. So for the Bucs, we have Jaquiz Rodgers, Peyton Barber. Now, although the Giants are one of the worst defenses against opposing running backs for fantasy purposes they face, giving up on average 28 fantasy points to opposing backs, and Matt Breida's breakout game last night, I still think that you have to sit all Tampa Bay running backs in this one, as they've combined for just 2 touchdowns on the year. There's better options out there this week, so in my opinion, stay away from Barber and Rodgers in this one. Now for the Giants, Saquon Barkley, auto start every week. He's proven himself to be matchup proof. He's a PPR machine, as the majority of us play in PPR leagues. All the receptions he's getting, just racking up the points for us, carries the ball at least 15 times a game. It never seems to come off the field just for a breather. And Wayne Gallman comes in, comes right back out. Saquon Barkley goes out there. So, not much needs to be said about Barkley's production this year and what's to expect moving forward. If you have him, you start him. Now we go down to Jacksonville, visiting Steelers, taking on the Jaguars. We'll start with Pittsburgh. And, we have James Conner. Been an absolute beast all year, not only for the Steelers team, but for fantasy owners. But he took a little bit of a beating last Thursday, against Carolina, and his status is still questionable from what I've been reading. So I think if you're a James Conner owner, you're going to want to monitor his status closely, in the days to come. If he's cleared to play, he's definitely a must-start, obviously, this week. Despite a tough matchup versus the Jags' run defense that allowed just, 19 fantasy points to opposing running backs this year. But I still think you got him, a lot of upside for James Conner. Must start. Now for the Jaguars, Fournette is back, and boy, did he look good on Sunday for fantasy purposes. Despite averaging 2 yards per carry, that's not what his fantasy owners were worried about. He still carried the ball 24 times, so we know the volume's there, and that's what's important. He scored once on the ground, and he also caught 5 catches for 56 yards and a touchdown through the air. He added 16 fantasy points for us just as a receiver. And the volume as a running back, I think the important thing to highlight, though, about this Jags backfield is that if you're one of those owners in Deep League or whatever who's holding on to TJ Yeldon or Carlos Hyde, I don't care how deep your league is, it's time to drop them. Plain and simple. They're going to have no value moving forward so long as Fournette remains healthy and doesn't, endure any setbacks. I think Doug Marrone and the Jags are going to rely heavily on him for the rest of the season. I think he's getting 20-plus carries a game with a huge goal line touch upside. They'll just continue to hand this guy the ball down and down again when they're near the goal line. But, a tough matchup against the Steelers' run defense that ranks 3rd best against opposing backs. But with the goal line carry upside, the absolute guaranteed value, the use as a receiver, seeing what Christian McCaffrey did to the Steelers last week, he's a high upside running back 1 for me. Must start this week. Now we go out to Detroit. And for the Panthers, we have Christian McCaffrey. And coming off a monster outing against Pittsburgh last week, like I just mentioned, he's faced with another juicy matchup against the Lions' run defense that's allowed a touchdown to opposing backfields in 4 straight games and over 20 fantasy points in each of those games. McCaffrey, a high-end running back 1 for me this week with tons of upside, absolute must start. Now for the Lions, it's really just Kerryon Johnson who's, warrants a considerable mention for fantasy purposes. And I know it's so frustrating for us Kerryon Johnson owners who watch time and time again goal line carries being handed to LeGarrette Blount. But I still think there's a lot of upside still for Kerryon. After what we saw last week in his involvement in the passing game, alongside Theo Riddick, I have a feeling this is going to be a back and forth game, meaning Kerryon Johnson will probably be giving around 15 carries, is what seems to be the case, more often than not. And he's going to be used as a receiver. I'm hopeful. And I think finally really be utilized as a receiver alongside Theo Riddick, and hopefully, for fantasy purposes, take away some of those looks from Theo Riddick and bring him his way. There's a lot of potential in this matchup, and I like Kerryon Johnson as a low-end running back too. Flex play this week. Now we have Cowboys in Atlanta. So we'll start with the Dallas Cowboys, and not sure, I'm not sure how Zeke has been for fantasy owners in terms of how have fantasy owners treated his production so far this year for someone that was, probably a consensus first-round pick in a majority of leagues. He hasn't been super impressive all year, but he still ranks in the top 10 among fantasy running backs. He's currently running back 9 right now, and he's coming off a 151-yard game and 2 touchdowns against the Eagles, who have a good run defense, and he has one of the best matchups of any backs this week of all running backs active, going up against the Falcons run defense that just gave up 36 fantasy points and over 200 yards scrimmage to Nick Chubb alone. I think this is an exciting matchup. This is as exciting as it can get, as a running back matchup can get, honestly. Sky's the limit for Zeke in this matchup. The run defense of the Falcons ranks second worst in the entire league against opposing backfields. High-end running back 1 for Zeke this week. Now we have the Falcons. So we have Tevin Coleman and Ito Smith. Now, definitely undoubtedly a disappointing outing for fantasy purposes for Tevin Coleman last week, who the week before he posted that, breakout 32-point fantasy outing and had owners very hopeful moving forward. And don't get me wrong, I still think Coleman bounces back, but he has limited, upside outside of his use as a receiver out of the backfield, right? So the Cowboys have been average against opposing running backs and have only allowed 1 touchdown on the ground in the past 5 games. Ito Smith is going to take away some of the value from Coleman. I think Coleman's value is going to be from his use in the receiving game. For me, Coleman has low-end running back 2. I put him at a low-end running back 2, and that's honestly as high as I would go. Maybe a flex play if, you're stacked at the running back spot and you're looking for someone to throw in the flex. But yeah, Tevin Coleman, I think he bounces back. I think you can rely on him this week. So give him the thumbs up. Bengals-Ravens now. Okay, so we'll start with the visiting Bengals. We have Joe Mixon, we have Giovanni Bernard. And Joe Mixon is the guy I like for Cincy. Obviously a disappointing outing last week for fantasy purposes. But, he was against the best run defense in the NFL. But outside of fantasy purposes, and this is important to know as fantasy owners, right? He ran the ball extremely well. He averaged 6 yards per carry. I think he had 10 carries for 61 yards, something like that. And that's the important thing to keep in mind, is that there was limited opportunity for Mixon to get touches considering the game script. But when he did, he looked great. And that's what's important to highlight. He faces another tough matchup against another top run defense who still ranks number 1 in defense against opposing running backs. That's the Baltimore Ravens. But over the past 3 weeks, the Ravens have given up 2 touchdowns on the ground and an average of 25 fantasy points to opposing backfields. And, with that in mind, and really no one, I don't think Gio's going to really contest with Mixon for touches out of the backfield. I think Joe Mixon, a lot of experts are saying that he's not a good play this week. I think he's a huge play this week, being that main guy out of the backfield. And the volume will be there because I believe, with Joe Flacco out and Lamar Jackson getting the start at quarterback for the Ravens, the Bengals are going to keep this game close. As painful as it, as it pains me to say it, the Bengals are going to keep this game close, giving Mixon tremendous upside in this matchup. I love Mixon as a low-end running back 1, high-end running back 2 for this matchup. Now for the Ravens. So Alex Collins has been disappointing as a whole so far this year, but he has scored 4 touchdowns over his last 4 games. That's important to note. And going up against a Bengals defense that has given up a rushing touchdown in all but only 3 games this year, it falls perfectly in line with the only possible upside for Alex Collins, and that's his goal line carries. I'm confident starting Alex Collins as a flex this week, maybe a low-end running back 2 in deeper leagues, with his real only upside, like I say, is his touchdown, ability, getting work on the goal line. So now we move out to Washington. We have the Texans against the Redskins. So for the Texans, we have Alfred Blue and Lamar Miller, who over the past 2 games have basically been splitting carries 50-50. It gives me some worry for Lamar Miller as he's the clear-cut starter of the 2, but I worry about the volume a lot. I think it's going to be limited for him this week against the Redskins defense that has only allowed 1 rushing touchdown over the past 5 games. I see very limited upside for Lamar Miller this week as he's been a non-factor in the passing game so far this year. And so for me, the highest I'd put Lamar Miller as a flex play in deeper leagues this week, and no consideration for Alfred Blue. As far as the Redskins go, obviously Adrian Peterson is the guy for the Redskins, and he's faced with the Texans' run defense that has been confusing to kind of understand. Okay, they've been average against opposing running backs this year, and 2 straight disappointing outings for AP. But if there was one good thing that came out of last week's game against Tampa Bay, is that the volume was there for AP. He had 19 carries, rushed for under 70 yards. I get it, no touchdowns. And I feel iffy about this game, to be honest. He's only scored twice. He's only scored twice in the last 6 games. And he is not really making an impact in the passing game as much as fantasy owners would hope for. Very low-end running back 2 flex play for me this week. I think he's a solid start in deeper leagues. This is probably, not that many other running backs getting the same amount of volume that AP is. So I like AP as a starter this week, and I think you can feel confident in that. So now we have Oakland against Arizona. So we'll start with the Raiders. We have Doug Martin and Jalen Richard. So I'm still standing very firm on my stance, my policy of not starting any Raiders offensive players for the rest of the season. However, they play a Cardinals team this week that's already allowed 6 games of over 100 rushing yards to opposing backfields and at least 1 touchdown in all but 2 games this year on the ground. The Cardinals are one of the worst in the entire league against the run, but unfortunately for the Raiders, there really isn't anyone that presents a whole lot of upside considering that they just flat out suck on offense. I mean, this is an offense that fails to move the ball to set up, scoring opportunities. And that's going to hurt these Raiders running backs for fantasy purposes. I think, though, in a PPR league, Jalen Richard presents more fantasy upside for me this week, but only in these super deep leagues of 12-plus teams, I would maybe consider starting either Doug Martin or Jalen Richard at no higher than a flex play. Now for the Cardinals, David Johnson owners are rejoicing. DJ finally had his breakout game of 37 fantasy points we were all waiting for, rushing for 2 yards shy of 100 and scoring 2 total touchdowns. 7 catches for like 70-something yards. I think the change of offensive coordinator has benefited Johnson tremendously. And he's been more utilized as a receiver as well than in the previous 7 games. He has, more receptions in the last 2 games than any of the previous games this whole year. Huge upside for David Johnson this week as he's up against an atrocious Raiders run defense that has given up 4 straight games of 100-plus rushing yards to opposing backfields. High-end, absolute running back 1 start for David Johnson this week. Now we go out west again. We have the Broncos and the Chargers. We'll start with the Broncos. So we have Royce Freeman, Devontae Booker, Phillip Lindsay. Now, Phillip Lindsay has been the clear-cut guy for the Broncos, for Vance Joseph this year, and with Freeman's status still up in the air for Sunday's game, and Booker really only being used as a receiving back, Lindsay is the guy to start out of this backfield. But, however, he's matched up against an average Chargers run defense that has given up a league average 24 fantasy points to opposing backfields. Okay, that's not where I'm concerned. It looks like a decent matchup for Lindsay, but the problem is for me is that the Chargers have allowed the fewest total points. I'm talking about points. I think they're averaging only 17 points against over the past 6 weeks during their winning streak. Lindsay has been a touchdown or bust kind of back this year. He's getting the value, he's getting the carries, but he has limited upside outside of goal line carries so long as Devontae Booker continues to be the focal point in that 2-minute offense and just being a receiver out of the backfield. I think only in deeper leagues you can comfortably start Lindsey this week as a low-end running back too. For the Chargers, MG3, if you have Melvin Gordon, you start him. Running back 6 on the year, averaging 23 fantasy points a week. Must start every week. But his counterpart, as far as Austin Eckler goes, I think he's got off to a hot start complimenting Gordon in the backfield since week 6. He was doing it great. His production has gone way down, though, to the point where I don't think you can comfortably start him, even as a flex play in super deep leagues. Stay away from Austin Eckler in this game. Now we go down south. We have the Eagles taking on the Saints. A full disclaimer, stay away from all Philadelphia Eagle running backs. Not only are none of them comfortable starts in any matchup, they're up against the number 1 run defense in the New Orleans Saints, who just came off holding Joe Mixon to just 10 fantasy points. I don't care if you're in a 20-man league, don't touch any Eagles running backs. This is going to be a game where the Eagles play from behind all afternoon, and there's virtually no upside for anyone in their backfield this week. Now for the Saints. Alvin Kamara, obvious start if you have him. Touchdown machine, reception machine. But, things get interesting when we start to talk about Mark Ingram. We started to have a fear that, where he's going to lose all fantasy relevance after averaging just 6.5 fantasy points after his first game back. However, last week against the Bengals, we saw him get a bulk of the carries thanks to the game script and him being utilized in the screen game. I think we see a very similar game script to what we did last week against the Eagles. And I can see Ingram putting similar numbers up on the board, especially after seeing Zeke Elliott run all over the Eagles last week. So for that reason alone, and just this week, I think this is a week-to-week basis with Ingram moving forward. I feel confident starting Mark Ingram as a low-end running back 2 play this week. So now we go up to Chicago versus Minnesota. Both run defenses have been great in fantasy against opposing backfields, both ranking in the top 8 in that category. So we'll start with the Chicago Bears. So, just when fantasy owners started to get their hopes up with Jordan Howard, seeing him score a touchdown in back-to-back weeks, he goes out there and lays a giant 4.5-point fantasy goose egg. Just terrible. Got a goal line carry stolen from him by Tariq Cohen. And then on the flip side, just when owners of Tariq Cohen were starting to worry about the work shifting more towards Jordan Howard, Cohen goes out there and has a decent fantasy day. This backfield for Matt Nagy's Bears is so tricky to try and figure out who's going to get the bulk of the work. And I still lean towards Tariq Cohen, though, since he's used more in the passing game, and Minnesota has only allowed 2 rushing touchdowns on the season. I think you sit Jordan Howard this week, but I like Tariq Cohen as a sneaky flex play at best. For the Vikings, we have Dalvin Cook. Finally 100% healthy for those of us who've been holding on to him. Hopeful that he'll be dominant in his return and carry us to fantasy victory. And, he looked great in his comeback game. They had a bye week last week. However, the Bears just last week gave up their first rushing touchdown of the season. They've only allowed 1 rushing touchdown all year and 1 game of over 100 yards rushing to opposing running backs. I don't feel extremely confident in Dalvin Cook, against the Bears in this matchup. And the fact that his last game was his first full game in over 2 months, I just feel that I'm slightly concerned with Dalvin Cook going up against this Bears defense. I think he presents a lot of upside as a receiver, especially in PPR league and the big playability. For that reason, I'm still iffy about it. This is really a hit or miss here. I think you can comfortably start him this week, low-end running back 2 or a flex play. But if you have some other options, more favorable matchups, I would tend to lean more towards that this week. And the Monday night game, shootout down in Mexico City, if you have Todd Gurley or Kareem Hunt, you're playing them. Plain and simple. There isn't much that can be said about 2 of the best backs in football right now. Must starts. If you got them, you start them. Don't trade them. They're going to carry you guys to victory every week. And that's that. So with that being said, that's going to wrap up the episode for the week. I look forward to next week shifting the podcast to more of a fantasy football oriented show, really going in depth on fantasy football, start sit-em advice, outlook, projections, etc., etc. As it's really nearing crunch time for most fantasy football leagues. Playoffs are just a few weeks away. So anyway, again, guys, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week.